We have previously made a distinction between the three descriptives used in the text to describe the relationship between man and the study of Torah, in which Torah as MATTANA stands apart from Torah as Yerusha and Torah as Mechira, in that Torah as both Yerusha and a Mechira is predicated on one of two types of a relationship that man has with God, and for which, for lack of a better descriptive, the reward that man receives for his or her study of Torah requires some involvement and effort on the part of man. This reward response, this kedusha, however, is one that is measured. It is limited in scope and relates to the degree and intensity of man's efforts. By way of example, we can use Newton's third law of motion, that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. Emphasis on the word equal. The more force, the greater the response. Less force, less response. And this could be used as a mashal to describe the reward kedusha response from HaKadosh Baruch Hu that results from man's efforts and involvement with Limud HaTorah. Whereas with respect to the matana aspect of Limud HaTorah, it was argued, is not linked and dependent upon the recipient. It is not a measured response according to the efforts and involvement of the recipient, but rather it is a metaphysical revelation. L'ma'ala mitam v'dat is the term that is used beyond the normal range of human endeavor, and in Kabbalistic terms is reflected in the 50th level of spiritual connection and comes about through an itaruta de la'elah. However, the Rebbe argues, even this itaruta de la'elah, the 50th level of kedusha, also has a component that is linked to the efforts of the recipient, not directly, but indirectly at the discretion of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And as the Rebbe noted, based upon the Gemara in Masechet Gittin, that one does not give a matana to just anybody, but rather to somebody for whom the giver has received some form of hana'ah, some form of pleasure and satisfaction, which translates into the view that the metaphysical lamala mitam vadat revelations of kedusha, although not directly linked to the efforts of the recipient, do come about on account of God's hana'ah and satisfaction, kaviyachol, that the Godhead receives from the efforts of man. This interaction is reflected in the Gemara's statement regarding Moshe Rabbeinu that it was only after Moshe had completed his avoda to the extent of his abilities and limitations as a human being in a physical body, his itaruta dilatata, only then, or possibly because of his efforts, was he able to activate God's response, in which he had access to the 50th level of Kedusha, the itaruta dila'elah. In the words of the Gemara in Masechet Nedarim, Chamishim Sha'arei Bina Nivru Ba'olam, there's a scale of 50 levels of Kedusha that exist. V'kulam natnu leMoshe chaser achat. Moshe was able to reach 49 of those levels, because that was the extent of his ability, given the fact that he was a physical being, and as such, the response is one that is measured according to the levels and efforts of the individual. When, however, he had completed his avoda to the extent of his limited capabilities as a physical entity, we have a follow-on statement from the same daf, one that on the surface is somewhat problematic, that Batchila haya Moshe lomed Torah. Moshe went through the 49 stages of Torah knowledge, but because of his physical limitations, umashkacha, he was given a mental block and forgot the Torah that he studied. Until eventually the Torah was given to him in the form of a matana, an itaruta de la'elah, and with the tools of the Kabbalistic model, he reached the 50th level of Torah knowledge. Using the thesis presented by the Rebbe, this came about not as a direct result of Moshe's efforts, but on account of the hana'ah, the pleasure, the satisfaction the God Kaviyachol received for the efforts of Moshe Rabbeinu. And this is the explanation of the distinction that is made between Yerusha and Mechira components of Torah study, both of which hinge upon a relationship between the recipient and the giver. The response is one that is limited, is measured according to the efforts of the individual, whereas Torah as a matana does not follow this paradigm, It is one which is lemala mitam vadas, does not depend directly on the relationship, but rather is linked to the hana'ah kavayachol that God receives from the efforts of man. This paradigm will be transferred by the Rebbe over to the issue of the Goral, in which on the one hand there was a Ruach HaKodesh metaphysical control over the Goral, but by the same token there needed to be the physical involvement of Aharon and the use of the Urim v'Tumim.